All right, so today we have my friend Andrew Burt, founder and CEO of Luminos AI, and he has a new article out, which we will talk about, but we'll talk about other things as well. So, Andrew, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I love it here. Great to be here.
All right, so interesting piece on basically the disconnect between the technology side and the risk and legal side. But let me start out by asking you. So when people in this space in AI talk about challenges that are not technical, they focus on things like ethics uh, and bias and things like that. So you specifically think that the legal and compliance risks are actually much more serious, right? So is this something that you're finding other teams coming to the same conclusion to?
Yes, although I'll say there's a big disconnect between the people thinking about the big issues and then the people like in the trenches that are actually building the systems or designing the systems or actually even doing applied research. And so there's a disconnect. The people thinking about the big issues are talking about Skynet and they're talking about, the future of cars without humans and, the trolley problems and all that stuff. And then you have the technical folks and the risk folks in the trenches who are having a really hard time deploying AI at the scale and the speed that they want to. And so there's this big kind of in between, and that's where I live, and that's what I'm thinking about. But I think for the most part, the people on the front lines are just frustrated. Like they're frustrated because it takes too long when they're doing anything really of consequence. And when legal or compliance get involved, it takes too long. And so I think the perspective that I bring is I'm trying to kind of zoom out for the people that are in the weeds. And again, and obviously we're going to talk about this today, but the biggest barrier to both AI adoption and the biggest barrier to doing things the right way, to having AI like align with our morals, is figuring out technically and practically how we can combine these two different teams and these two sets of expertise. Because if we can't have those teams meet, we're going to have philosophical debates on one hand and then AI being deployed without proper review on the other.
So listeners have heard me mention this on this podcast, the fact that these days actually it's much easier to build an interesting prototype than ever before, right? So years ago, it'll take you a while to build an interesting prototype. Now, maybe it takes you a week to build something that looks on first blush to be viable and interesting. So, you on the other hand, you're saying that actually it's a huge step between that interesting first blush prototype to actually deploying. And on the other hand, I'm here in Silicon Valley where people are still trying to move fast and break things. So can both things coexist?
Yeah, I mean, there's a maturity spectrum. So you can move fast and break things when you're dealing with prototypes, when you're at the beginning, when you're trying to prove that something works. Once you're at a different level of the maturity spectrum, when you are deploying AI systems that touch, millions or hundreds of millions of people in ways that are serious. This is not like I'm recommending the next movie, that you want to watch in your queue. This is not like that. This is like segmenting marketing offers where you're giving, certain people really good deals and other people not good deals, or, healthcare advice or whatever it might be. There are a lot of different ways that AI systems can actually significantly affect people, outside of the movie recommendations. And those actually need real oversight. And we can see that literally just in like, the way that the public is thinking about and talking about AI. 2024 was really a banner year in terms of AI laws and regulations. And so more scrutiny is coming, more oversight is coming. There's a lot of worry that's happening. And honestly, I think anytime someone worries about Skynet, again, I'm just like using that as a metaphor, but when you hear, AI is scary and the future of AI and, humans are going to get replaced, that's philosophical. Great, great to talk about. It is not practical, but it's a signal. It's really like reading the tea leaves. It's a signal for how concerned people are, and that's why we'll talk about this, I think, throughout this conversation, but 2024 really was a banner year. We have the AI Act in Utah passed, the AI Act in Colorado, bunch of stuff happening in California. The AI Act in the EU is about to come into effect. So like all of this, I think, is a symbol of how much more difficult it's going to be to deploy AI in practice kind of going forward. I do want to talk about culturally, like the prototype culture, which is very strong in the data science world, but also I don't want to filibuster you. So let me just pause.
Oh, no, no. So yeah, we'll get back to that. But um, so your perspective is definitely much more from that legal compliance uh, angle. So do you make a distinction, Andrew, between let's say internal versus external applications, right? So by that I mean, for example, I could have a chatbot internally that's helping me internally. It's not outward facing to customers. It might be helping me internally navigate whatever knowledge base it is in the company. Do you make a distinction between that and the one that actually faces customers in terms
Oh
of
yeah, yeah, definitely.
the level of rigor and inspection?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, the real question is what could go wrong? Like that is the proxy for how much oversight there's going to be. So like what could go wrong? If it's like suggesting code as you write code or whatever it is, if there's like really a human in the loop, then yeah, oversight is going to decrease. I mean, the example that we always talk about is like optical character recognition for like, processing receipts, you don't need real oversight for that. But if you're touching a customer, one thing that's actually really interesting, there are all these really interesting ways that AI can have significant risks. And so a lot of things, well, there are two examples that come to mind, and this is like outside of the generative AI space. So some is just like customer segmentation when you call into a call center. So like it'll predict how good a customer you're going to be, and then you get routed, to the best customer service agent. That can be a real issue if you're wrong and you're taking, like I don't know, um, black women, and you're basically saying they're going to be the worst customer when this happens, and then you're consistently giving them, a terrible customer experience. That can be a real issue from a legal perspective. We saw a few years ago. This was a very interesting example. We've seen in a couple places the use of facial recognition in public spaces. Those models actually tend to perform less well on people who, frankly, aren't white and aren't white males. And so, one of the like really, it honestly was a very powerful example of how important it could be is these facial recognition systems were basically segmenting people based on race. And so work really well for like white people, especially white males, and then the farther you go away from that, people of color, they wouldn't work well. And so these systems, like they have a real ability to screw things up. And so you have to think about like what could go wrong and how could it affect people. And again, that's anyway.
And
That's
it doesn't have to be customers either. So here's an example that comes to mind. So these days now there's these skills assessment tools, right? So that rely on generative AI for the actual skills assessment. So the skills assessment tool could be used internally to determine, hey, let's assemble a team of 10 people to work on this project, and we'll use the skills assessment tool internally, right? So not outward facing, but uh, it could have consequences there as well if it turns out that the skills assessment tool is biased or
yeah.
whatever, right?
It's a huge issue. Yeah. And I'll say, okay, so like traditionally data science team, like this is not just a legal issue, it's a performance issue. And so we want to get the data science and the technical folks to realize that if your model is performing differently on different groups, that's an issue. And this is not just about bias, there are privacy issues, what the data the model's trained on. And then for generative AI, what the model actually outputs, their copyright issues. But yeah, we see that in the like employment, HR opportunity space. It's a real issue. And I'll just say one thing that we see all the time is when people are actually focusing on like the issue of bias in employment opportunities or creating teams, they look at the positive selections, like who got selected to the team, and then that's where they start. But the problem actually tends to be there's a huge number of people who are actually, not selected. Those would be what, like false negatives. And there's a huge amount of issue and like bias and lack of access to opportunities in that group. And so there are all sorts of ways that you can run into trouble. And I'll just say the big thing. So I would say like pre 2024, this was really important. A lot of companies were taking it seriously, but not enough. Not a huge percentage of all, companies doing this. But from 2024 onwards, it's no longer going to be optional. So you're going to see more and more laws and more regulations mandating this. And like, again, we have states like Colorado and Utah that have clear laws on the books. And so for people that are wondering, and a lot of data scientists I know are like, this is not going to affect me. We are with AI right now where we were with privacy about 10 years ago. And so if you think who has to comply with privacy laws, anyone working with data at any scale. And the exact same thing is starting to happen with AI.
Yeah, and so I think the point I'm making about internal versus external facing apps is something that I want to bring up because there's enough surveys which show that it seems like if the app is internal facing, teams are more quickly pulling the trigger, right? So they're deploying to production more quickly. They're less reluctant. So, do you think that the teams are going to make this distinction as far as the things you're talking about, that they are going to be less likely to be careful if it's an
Yeah,
external
I
thing?
mean, this is risk. So you're saying like teams are ready to pull the trigger when it's internal because the risk is lower. As
Yeah.
the risk goes up, there's more and more reluctance. And again, so like I'm at Luminos AI, like we're building tools for this. So I'm really focused on the tool set. But if you zoom out, that reluctance is the biggest barrier to AI adoption because either we're going to have people who aren't deploying it for the serious use cases. And when everyone's excited about AI, it's not just like internal efficiency, it's extra, like the big use cases are external. So we're either going to have people not using AI. So that sucks. Like we're not getting the value out of the AI. We're not like, or uh, uh, they're going to be doing it without the right level of oversight. So either they're not doing it or they're going to deploy it and it's not going to be compliant and it's not going to be managed for risk. And so that's why like here at this granular level where we're building tools for this, that's why we see like a much bigger mission. Because unless we can have a tool that connects these, our options are no AI or crappy AI, and everyone loses when that's the case.
Actually, based on our conversations, I put in my things of list of items that AI teams should pay attention to this year is this whole topic of legal sign-offs, right? So the notion
Yeah.
that legal sign-offs will be increasingly be required. So can you paint a picture of what happens today when a company tries to deploy an AI system? So what is the disconnect between the technical and legal teams? And actually, maybe to make it concrete, if you can share a anonymized or non-anonymized example of that actually
Yeah.
kind of paints a picture of why this is such an issue.
Yeah. Okay. So the main risks that we talk about and focus on right now, there are three. So there's fairness, there's privacy, and then there's copyright. All of them are big with Gen AI, copyright, not so much with like classical AI systems. I spent a lot of time focused on bias. I know I'm not going to make a terrible joke about me being biased to bias, but I'll just talk about bias right now. And so, I mean, honestly, there's so many examples. Like we talked about the facial recognition one. It comes up a lot in marketing, honestly, in
No,
ways
no.
that,
I mean, I think an example of where
yeah, the back and
you,
forth, you mean.
you can see that they're struggling
Yeah.
with
Okay.
communication.
So here are the steps. So like it'll start and we'll have a data science team realize there's an issue, like this could be biased, like the facial recognition one or whatever. In some cases, they've already deployed the model. In other cases, they're about to. So it's not at the beginning of the model, development lifecycle. And they say, oh crap, someone needs to sign off on this. So like we don't get in trouble, we don't get sued, whatever. And then
Wait,
they'll
wait,
ask,
wait, wait.
yeah.
So they know it's biased. They still want to deploy it, but they just want to have
Um,
some cover.
It depends. There's no way to get rid of bias. You
Yeah,
just
yeah,
you
yeah.
can't do
Of
it. The
course.
real question is what's an acceptable level.
Yeah.
And so there are all sorts of places that data scientists can land in terms of understanding that. But sometimes everybody knows. Sometimes we've seen this a lot. There'll be like, a woman or a person of color or something on the team that's like, hey guys, something's not right. So there are a bunch of different reasons why someone might bring up that question. The teams that are more aware, there's like training and they know this is an issue. There are all sorts of ways. I mean, like privacy, everybody knows. Again, this is where we're going with AI, but the issue will come up, or the company will have a policy, go get sign off, whatever it is. There'll be a need to have someone approve it. We've seen some data scientists that are just like, this is a CYA thing. So there are all
So,
sorts of reasons. Yeah.
so by the way, at least what I'm gleaning from what you're saying so far is that at least they're checking.
Many of them. Yes. I mean, again, it's the Wild West. And the
Yeah.
reason why 2024 is such a big year is because we're in the same direction as privacy. Like it's not optional, but right now
Uh,
there are different stages, different types of ways of thinking about this.
so let's assume I'm in one of these good teams that I'm actually doing some checking.
Okay, so we got Ben. We got Ben. You're great. Honestly, I'd say you're about to deploy a model. You're not even there yet, and you say, okay, we need to make sure we get sign off. So you would go to either the chief privacy officer or the general counsel, someone in legal. Right now, it's I'd say 70% legal, sometimes responsible AI teams, and you'd say, okay, let's make sure that this is kosher, this is okay. And then you would get into a month-long back and forth. And so legal, say legal for now, would say, great, Ben, tell me about your model. Who's going to use it? What went into it? What test did you do? Who else was involved? Where's it going to be deployed? And you'd say, great, I need to get back to you because, your documentation information will be on Jupyter notebooks and GitHub and emails. So best case scenario, a couple days to a week goes by, you come back to legal, either via Zoom or an email, and you say, okay, here's all that you'll do an information dump. It'll be, documents, whatever, and they'll say, great, let me review it. 1 to 2 weeks come by, they'll come back and they'll say, okay, we need some clarification, tell me more. There'll be a very long back and forth. Once you get to the point where they're like, okay, let's see some quantitative tests, then you'll have to figure out what those tests are. You'll run the tests, then you'll have to figure out what those, what they mean, what to do about it. We've seen with customers, the typical time that takes is like minimum 2 to 3 to 6 months. We actually saw one customer, it takes them 12 months, which is insane to get approval. And that's one model.
By the
So,
way, what you've described so far, I'm impressed by the sophistication of the legal team. That they're show me your tests, you know?
I mean, well, what are the other options? It's like, the Winston Churchill quote, like democracy is the worst system of government except for all the others. Like, what else are they going to do? The legal team needs to see
No, but
something.
do should our listeners interpret this as the legal teams actually having technical people inside the legal team?
No.
No.
No, and I mean, it's part of the problem is like the technical people need to be able to work with the legal and the risk people. Otherwise, but again, the questions that I went through, that's where they're going to come to anyway. Legal and risk can't sign off for something like bias unless there have been bias tests. They can't just say, they can't ask a data scientist, is this biased? And they say, yeah, but not that much. And they say, okay, great.
And
Like, let's
how does the legal team know these days, Andrew, that the tests are they have enough coverage or the tests are appropriate if the legal team themselves are not sophisticated?
I mean, they reach out to us.
I
They
see.
use the tool. Sometimes, I mean, a lot of times they'll go to like outside counsel and ask, but it's really laborious. It takes a lot of time.
And that's why it's a month for one model. And by the time that model is approved, they might have already wanted to update it and they learned something to make it even better, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is a bottleneck. And I'll just say, yes, if they don't know what tests to run, we've seen it take a long time. But even if they know what tests to run, it takes a very long time because the data scientists have to go actually run the tests. We see all the time data scientists want to do their own testing and they'll get excited about like XAI or causal analysis or whatever. Great, really cool. That stuff tends to be meaningless from a legal or like a defensibility perspective. And so again, you have this like bifurcated market, and you even see it with the tooling. If you look at the risk tooling that data scientists use, it's great, but it's meant for technical people and it's more or less focused on performance. And so even the tools, the like governance tools that are marketed just to the data scientists, they're great, but they don't carry over to the risk people because they don't actually mean a lot in terms of getting sued. And so like one of the things that we focus on all the time, anytime you're doing a test for risk, you need to have clear thresholds. You need to know what's a pass, what's a fail. If you don't, you're just, again, you're going to this world of philosophy where you debate what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. You have no clear kind
So
of
even before you start.
before you start. All tests are not created equal. It's fine to use these cool newer tests, but if you don't know what's a pass and what's a fail, and you haven't decided that and it's not clear, you're in a lot of trouble because you're going to slow things down. And anyway, it's an issue. We see it all the time.
And a pass and fail is defined by the legal team based on whatever jurisdiction this model.
Yes. So that's something we used to help with. So, Luminos AI spun out of Luminos.law, which was just acquired. I'm now, full-time Luminos AI on the software. But there are a lot of questions about what are the right tests to use. And so into the Luminos AI platform, like all of that is clear. The law firm used to help a lot with that. Our answer is basically look to, for bias, look to the last 50 years of anti-discrimination law. Anytime a court case or regulatory agency has kind of endorsed or cited a clear threshold, that's where you want to start. That's where you want to start. You want to anchor your analysis again in things that are clear, because even the newest, coolest test is going to have issues with thresholds, and it's probably going to like be old very quickly, just in terms of how fast things move. So it doesn't. We're not saying don't use these new tests, but we're saying you need to anchor all of your testing in things that are clear and have clear thresholds. Otherwise, you're in trouble. You're debating ethics and philosophy. Nothing wrong with that, but you're standing in the way of using AI. Or again, you're not using AI as fast as you want to be, or you're just skipping, the legal oversight risk requirements.
So the shiny new toys are these foundation models, the generative AI, and the things that we've discussed so far, bias. It seems like we've been talking about those for 10 years. They precede this new set of models, right? So this new set of models introduce things, I guess, like copyright, intellectual property, kind of risks, right? So are there enough? Are there enough kind of tools out there right now for companies to use to I guess I hate to use the word immunize themselves against these sort of risks that
I mean,
generate. So what would you say? So top line, what are the things that are generative AI specific, and what's the state of what are the state of tools for
yeah.
immunizing yourself?
Um, I am a weird, nerdy person that I get excited about like all these risks. Like it's really excites me. Gen AI is so interesting. It's so exciting. A lot of the old risks carry over. We can
Yep,
talk about
yep.
them. And then they're the new,
Yeah. So what are
IP
new?
risks. Copyright IP. I think what's really new, and I don't know why people don't talk about this anymore. Like 20 years ago, like the rise of really big data, people talked about the three V's, variety, velocity, and volume. No, sounds like you remember that. I don't know why that's not talked about anymore. But that is why, from a risk perspective, from my point of view, that's why generative AI is so different. Like the three V's are just on a completely different scale. We're not generating like predictions, we're generating content and text and videos and audio and images. And so all of the issues you have normally are just like on steroids. And they appear in different ways. So they're like different ways, you test for it. But even, I mean, you'll see a lot. So there's like the infamous Google, Gorilla label example, which I think was like 2016 or 2017. And so that was like a image classifier, and it was classifying a lot of Black people as gorillas. Interestingly, I think Google actually never fixed that. They just stopped using the label. So imagine something like that, but now you're generating,
And
videos, which is a lot of images. Yeah, go for it.
what percentage of your conversations are in the category of generative AI and foundation models?
I don't know what percentage, more and more. I don't honestly, maybe like 80%. It's huge because I don't know, people love it's new, it's the new it thing, it's sexy, people are rushing to deploy it. But again, Gen AI is a really good example. If you look at the data, it is a huge hype, a lot of money going in terms of people actually deploying it in like high stakes, very important environments. It's just not there yet. There are huge barriers to adoption. And
Lot,
so
lot, lot of internal.
exactly.
A lot of
Internal,
internal deployments, right?
yeah. There's
Because
this thing.
basically, like I said there, you can let's say the simplest example, you can deploy a RAG system to help your knowledge workers, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I hear there was like this like I don't know, it's a little corny, but there's artificial intelligence AI and then there's IA, intelligence augmentation.
Mhm.
And the latter is less sexy, but a lot of what we're doing now is IA. It's like how can we augment our own intelligence with these tools, internal use cases? It's not the more exciting things that people are hyping. And I think that's the big difference. We want to get to AI. We want these like really transformational use cases, but they're few and far between because of the risks.
You mentioned intellectual property and copyright. I mean, this year, obviously, and I think I kind of thought last year it would play out even more, but this year I think uh, you'll start hearing people talk more about agents. Um, and agents could, there's a spectrum, right? So probably this year it's mostly very narrow, very task specific agents that are much more autonomous. And the reason I say this is there's just hundreds of companies working on it. So
Yeah.
there's going to be some amount of deployments of agents. So what are some risks that come to mind when you start hearing people talk about generative AI or agents?
So I don't know what to make of agents. We've had customers, at the law firm last year, clients were asking a lot about this, like how practical and realistic is this going to be, not internally, but in some of these more high impact, more exciting, external use cases. The truth is, I don't know. But when we talk about the three V's, it just keeps on getting kind of worse from a risk perspective. So, like one Gen AI system already hard to manage the risks. Like, what does that mean? I kind of hope we can talk about constitutional AI from Anthropic and Lighthouse, what we're building at Luminos AI. But you're basically just like stacking risks on top of each other, and they're like exponential. So you have one Gen AI system. Okay, how do we manage that risk? And then you connect it to another, and then suddenly with like agents, you have this complex web of AI systems interacting with each other. And I'll just say what my belief and what we're working on here at Luminos is there is no real meaningful way to have traditional human oversight in a world where you have multiple Gen AI systems talking to each other. It's just not possible. And so the only way to do this is to very carefully and thoughtfully and conscientiously build oversight AI into that kind of system. And there are different ways to do that. We have one approach. Again, we call it Lighthouse. But it's the only way to do things. It's just the only way to do things. I'm worried about like,
And by the way, AI teams are already doing this, right? So using AI to eval AI. Yeah.
yeah. Although the way that I'm seeing that, it's very primitive. And honestly, it's a good example of how the folks who think about performance optimization just don't have the risk expertise. A lot of what we see is like LLM as a judge, where you're using one language model and you're having it do very, very basic evaluation. The Anthropic example, great applied research at Anthropic. They evaluate for the three H's, it's honesty, helpfulness, and harmfulness. Great. But that does not align to real risk requirements like FTC oversight. It's just way too simplistic. And so, if you're going to do that in a way that is meaningful and defensible from a legal standpoint, you need a lot more granularity. And so, there's like a foundation for this, but it needs to be way more sophisticated for, this world to really take off.
Yeah, I would imagine you at the minimum you need something fine-tuned for that specific risk. And secondly, I always would use at least three models to judge, right? So kind of like
Mhm.
a jury
And
system. Like
that's a big, yeah, that's a big internal learning that we have made, which is if you're only using one system, you're going to have some real issues in terms of oversight. On the other hand, though, the more systems you use, like the more of an issue you're going to have with latency. And so it's a real delicate balance. It's a real delicate balance. And it's why a lot of the times this LM as a judge model is really only used right now in training, which is great. but we need to get to a place where this type of system can actually be used in deployment, because ultimately that's what we need.
So last year, we introduced this concept of the AI alignment platform, which is kind of a central place that unifies the management of these risks holistically, but also cross-functionally across teams with different backgrounds and different requirements, right? What is the current status of the AI alignment platform concept? Do Have people kind of resonated with this? I think it's clear that you need something like this, right?
Yeah. I
But
mean,
but I'm biased, so
yes.
I wanna hear what you're hearing from in the field.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say, okay, so right now it's completely misaligned. If you're thinking about risk, not only do you have all these different teams, you have all these different risks, you have all these different tools. And again, thinking about this bottleneck as both a practical and like a moral and legal issue, like even that alone, all the silos are bottlenecks, so it can't scale. So the only answer is you need to align all of them in a place where approval and oversight can be automated. And like that's our mission. So our mission is that in terms of how that's resonating, um, everyone
It
can
seems
get.
commonsensical, right?
It does, but I mean, in IT, things don't operate according to common sense. Like IT broadly, like if you go into any enterprise
Yeah.
and look at all the different IT systems, and it's like people make different decisions at a different point in time, and then you have this like complicated mosaic where no one really owns it, and it's a mess. And honestly, it's part of the reason why infosec is so hard because just things aren't simple. So that's what the world of AI needs, like some type of like alignment platform to actually allow things to scale. Otherwise, there's no real long-term future for like trustworthy and reliable AI. And so we see people recognize that. At the same time, it's a little bit scary because you're looking at this very messy world and we're saying, look, you got to clean it up. Like we're here to help you, but like if you can't simplify it, you're not going to get what you want. And so it's a little bit of like long term, how are you going to make this real? But it's a problem. We see it everywhere.
So you're in the middle of this journey of building this alignment platform. So you have some early people using it. So what's the feedback so far?
Yeah, the feedback is we have needed this for a very long time. The feedback is once people understand how to get around this bottleneck and speed it up, they can suddenly, I don't want to say like see the light, but they can suddenly see a future where they can deploy AI at scale the way they've been talking about it, the way their executives and boards have been talking about it. Like this is the thing that unblocks it. And so we see a lot of like aha moments. And we're working to make that easier and more available.
And by the way, for our listeners, and I'll link to the post we wrote last year. It's not just a question of having people from different backgrounds uh, collaborate and communicate with each other. It's not just a place, it's not like a simple Google Doc where you can just kind of exchange information, make it convenient for people. But it's also making sure that they have a shared user interface, shared language, shared reports, right?
Yeah, and also like yes, an easy integration. Like the problem is the longer it takes for all these people involved to communicate, the harder it is, the more of a bottleneck it becomes. And again, you can't do AI at scale unless you can have some efficiency. Another good way to think about this from like the people with the risk hat is you need some way to triage. Like there aren't enough people to spend all their manual time looking and evaluating and looking at every single AI system. So they need some way to say, okay, this is where I need to spend my time as like a human with a lot of expertise and nuance, and I don't need to spend my time on all these other things. And so like that's a big part of the AI alignment platform, which is how can we build in rules into this like collaboration and knowledge and documentation workflow. So what needs to be reviewed is only the most important stuff because again, this is a resource issue, it's a time issue. Yeah, and again, I think people like when you talk about tooling, people get really focused on, okay, like what does this do? And like, here's a widget, but like it's a moral issue from our perspective because again, either you have crappy AI being deployed without oversight, or you have AI not being deployed, as it's needed. And so that's why we see something that sounds simple. I mean, not simple, but we see a tool and we see this like much, much, much broader kind of mission that we're supporting.
So we're having this conversation in the early days of a new administration here in the US that has pledged to approach AI in a much more kind of flexible, deregulated way, the so-called make AI great again kind of approach. So what's your sense in terms of the regulatory landscape for AI? You mentioned state level regulations, but now you have the Trump administration that people are anticipating are going to be a lot more friendly to the tech industry and to AI in general, and they're much more likely to make sure that the U.S. is probably going to maintain its lead. Although I think early signs are that they will keep a lot of what the Biden folks have done around export controls and the latest thing being the diffusion of AI technologies policies that the Commerce Department implemented. Um, but I suppose that they could probably lean on the EU to to make sure that the EU AI Act doesn't slow down US companies. So what's your sense of the regulatory landscape in the next 1 to 2 years?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's pretty clear and predictable what's going to happen, especially because we have the data from the first Trump administration. There will be, this like AI power competition, especially with China. Like we're going to see a lot there, like you talked about, like export controls and regulations. But there's not going to be a big federal law on AI. Like there's not going to, the oversight, the compliance burden, that's not going to come from the federal government. And like I said before, we're going to see AI, like the future of AI is privacy right now. The exact same thing happened with privacy. There's no single, privacy law at the federal level. Frankly, the federal government hasn't done much on privacy in a very long time. And so what you have in that environment is states step in to fill in the gap. And so we have, something like 24 privacy laws at the state level in the US, which is honestly worse. It's worse for companies because they have this really, really complicated compliance landscape where they have to look at different states, and it ends up just being people default to the most difficult state. The state with the most stringent laws on the books in the U.S. That tends to be California. So whatever California says on a privacy level, that's what all the big companies do. We're going to see the same thing in AI, and that's what already started to happen in 2024 with Colorado and Utah. So like we've seen this before, we know where it's going, and so the truth is it doesn't really matter what the Trump administration does because the states are already stepping in. I think what we're going to start to see from the tech companies is they might actually start to push for an AI law at the federal level because that will preempt the stuff at the states and frankly make it easier. But I'm not expecting, honestly, I don't think anyone is expecting a whole lot of progress on that front in the next 4 years, at the national level.
So the one difference, Andrew, is that in the previous Trump administration, there was not as many uh, tech advisors, or the influence of the tech industry was not that apparent. It seems like in this case, at least in the early days, there's a lot of influence from the tech community, and the tech community may want to get ahead of this issue, right? So they don't want
Yeah.
to. I assume they don't want to be in a position where nothing happens for the next 4 years and someone takes over and suddenly they're in the situation like the crypto industry found itself from 2020 to 2024 with
Yeah.
so they
I
want
don't.
to control their destiny, no?
It's possible. It's possible. I mean, in terms of like betting on the internal dynamics of advisors and the Trump administration, I think history has, like, if history's shown anything, it's bumpy and unpredictable. So who knows what actual real influence a lot of these advisors are going to have internally. I expect it to be a mess. Great. If we can get new federal, regulation on AI, great. That would be great. It would simplify things. It would be easier for everyone, assuming that it's actually meaningful. But I think that's very unlikely. And I think the states are going to step in to fill the gaps, and they already are doing that. So that's what I bet would happen. But anything's possible. Anything's possible, especially in a Trump administration.
But AI is an issue where I don't think the president Trump he doesn't really have that much of a position on this issue. So he might actually defer to his tech advisors, who are much more deregulatory in mindset, right? So,
Yeah, I
so
mean,
they
yeah.
might introduce some legislation just to force some kind of national thing that is a lot softer than some of the state rules. No?
It's totally possible. I mean, what I will say is in the first Trump administration, like Trump did do stuff on AI oversight. There was an executive order on AI oversight. Trump tends to be, honestly, it's confusing. Right now, I think the Republican Party is going through kind of a revolution in terms of what it stands for. Is it light touch, with federal government rules? Is it a little bit more kind of overbearing? And so you see a lot of these different policy advisors go back and forth. I have no idea where it's going to end up, but there might be new regulation. Again, I would not count on it. I think, the most likely outcome is there's no new real national laws on AI, but it's possible, and at the very least, and that you've seen this from the government and over the last decade, there will be a lot of headlines. There's a lot, I might call it marketing. It's everyone AI sexy. Everyone wants to be involved in AI. Everyone wants to either build it or say they're doing something about it or thinking about it. And so you're definitely going to see regulatory agencies saying they're doing new stuff. You're going to see lawmakers, doing new AI initiatives. They're going to be AI safety institutes and this and that. All of it's great. I expect a lot of it. There's not going to be a lot of there. And in my experience, like we've seen a lot of that, and there's not a lot of there. So at the very least, you're going to see people talking about AI, whether it's going to actually materialize into concrete regulations, things that make people change their behavior, laws. I don't know, but my bet is really on the states. My bet is the states are going to step in, especially the more liberal ones. You're going to see regulations in the Northeast. You're going to see, in the West Coast, Illinois, different parts. So my bet is by the end of the Trump administration, we're going to have between a dozen and 2 dozen state level laws on AI on the books that companies are going to have to comply with.
Plus the overseas rules. So,
Yeah.
which in closing actually strengthens the argument for why you should get your act together as far as risk management and legal compliance, and
Yeah.
why something like an alignment platform actually is the only scalable and insane way to really control this problem, right?
Yeah. I mean, we think it's the right thing to do just in general, but it's no longer optional. Like every year that goes by, it's going to be more and more required. And it's not going to be optional. So if you can't figure out how to do it, it's going to stand in the way of making AI real.
And with that, thank you, Andrew.
All right. Thank you.